There is a spectrum of signed languages used in the United States. American Sign Language is by far the most common, but you may also come in contact with a couple others. So we're going to talk about the differences, what they are and what they aren't, and who uses which. So we'll start with ASL. American Sign Language is used by the majority of the deaf people living in the United States and Canada. ASL is a language separate and different from English with a different grammatical structure. Because it's a visual language, ASL is not limited to just signs or words, but also involves facial expression, body movement, and spatial features. It has its own idioms too. Like all languages, ASL changes over time and has regional variations as well as different pronunciations. That's what I call them, which is basically two ways to sign the same thing. We talked before about good or good. They can be signed the same way, just a different way of pronouncing it. All right, another form of signing is called Sign Exact English. It lately has been called manually coded English, so you might see either one. In the early 1970s, Signed Exact English was developed by Dr. Geraldine Gustafson, who was deaf herself. It uses ASL signs with some added signs in order to visually represent the grammar and vocabulary of English in English sentence structure. It is not its own language. It is English portrayed by signs, similar to Morse code, right? It's a different way of presenting English, but it's still English. Some of those signs added that I mentioned would be things that don't have ASL signs. Like we talked before about ASL not having articles like or the. In Signed Exact English, Dr. Gustafson created signs for those words, English words, that didn't have ASL signs. So like I mentioned, this sign system is sometimes called manually coded English. You notice I called it a sign system and not a sign language because it's not a language by itself. It's just English in a different, coded form. So the purpose behind Signed Exact English or manually coded English was to make it easier for a deaf person to learn how to speak English, and it was tended to be used in an educational setting. I should add there, not just speak English, but read and write English. All right, so if we look at signed languages on a spectrum, like is shown here, you can see that ASL would be on one side and manually coded English would be on the other. All right, so there's actually something in the middle. Somewhere in between ASL and manually coded English is Pidgin or Pidgin signed English. So you can see by the spelling, that's not the bird. Pidgin, the bird, a pigeon bird. Pidgin signed this way, P-I-D-G-I-N, is actually a common word for mixed languages. So Pidgin signed English or PSE isn't signed English, but it isn't ASL either. Pidgin languages occur throughout the world when two languages exist side by side. A Pidgin language is generally a grammatically simplified language that develops between two groups who do not have a common language. Therefore, a Pidgin language is not a true language, but it's a means to get by. I actually periodically interpret for a woman who is deaf, grew up speaking, and is very comfortable with English, very comfortable with speaking English. She has a hard time. She needs an interpreter because she has a hard time always reading lips and like catching what's going on behind her when she doesn't see somebody's lips moving, right? So she needs an interpreter. But every time I get a job request to go interpret for her, the request is actually that I sign Pidgin signed English. She prefers PSE to manually coded English and to ASL. So there are some people who actually prefer to sign PSE. Not a lot. I mostly get interpreting jobs for ASL. So PSE has aspects of ASL and aspects of sign exact English, and it often manifests as ASL signs in English word order. So PSE is somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. Signers signing Pidgin may tend a little toward the ASL side of the spectrum. Others may tend a little more toward the English side of the spectrum. It just depends on personal preference and background. One other thing, signed system to understand is called simultaneous communication. It's often shortened to be called SIMCOM. It's a form of Pidgin signed English, and it's spoken English and sign language used at the same time, or speaking while signing. So I can sign that sentence to you and speak it at the same time, right? SIMCOM, as it's commonly called, is spoken English and sign language used at the same time. So that's not really ASL. Those are ASL signs, but it's following my spoken English word order and just kind of the English way of saying things. And so that's what SIMCOM is. It's simultaneous communication. Because of the structural differences in English and ASL constructs, it is impossible to sign ASL and speak English at the same time. Therefore, SIMCOM is usually spoken English, signed with PSE, or signed exact English. In Pidgin, and this is true throughout the world in different Pidgin languages, the strongest language, which is usually the spoken one, is the one that's maintained and used correctly, while the weaker language, usually the signed one, becomes a broken or degraded version of what it would otherwise be if it were the only language being used. Now, when we talk about one being stronger and one being weaker, it's not that the language itself is strong or weak, it's how it's used, right? So I could talk, sign, same time. I could speak what's being signed in ASL, but I don't. Usually when you SIMCOM, you stick with English because that's what flows most naturally. And then the ASL is, like it says here, kind of broken or degraded in order to fit into the English, the spoken English that you're using. Sometimes students think that they will learn ASL better if they can see it and hear spoken English at the same time. This is actually an inaccurate assumption because students aren't actually seeing ASL when SIMCOM is used. What you're really seeing signed is a form of Pidgin signed English. And that's why we won't ever SIMCOM in class. I'm not going to sign and talk at the same time. Sometimes I'll talk things through, but not strictly signing and speaking at the same time. So remember, sign or sign not. There is no SIMCOM. All right, so who signs which signed language or system? Oh, actually, before we talk about this, I want to mention really quickly. When I am in the presence of a deaf person and also in the presence of a hearing person who doesn't sign, I'm thinking one of my deaf friends and my husband, for example. He knows a little ASL, but not enough to get by. So I will SIMCOM then because I want to show respect for my deaf friend by making language accessible to her. And I also want to show respect to my husband by like not talking in front of him in the language he's not going to understand, right? So in that case, I would SIMCOM. And that's really just to show respect for both languages and both people. But generally speaking, I don't ever SIMCOM, and it's better not to. It's better to stick with one language and do it well than to kind of mess with both of them at the same time. All righty, so who signs which sign language or system? You may meet a deaf person who signs signed exact English, or you may meet a deaf person who doesn't sign at all, but rather speaks. You may also meet a deaf person who signs Pidgin signed English. However, you will most likely meet a deaf person who signs ASL. Factors that contribute to these differences, who signs what, are the person's education, often what language they were taught as a child, the person's degree of hearing loss or the age at which hearing loss occurred. In other words, whether or not they learned to speak and are comfortable speaking. The person's upbringing, because some children are not allowed to sign and some are accepted as deaf while others are made to be as hearing as possible. And the degree to which the person feels connected to hearing people or other deaf people. The influence of language, or language is influenced by early childhood, life. So people using ASL, PSE, or C, it's called MCE. These factors also come into play. So here are some facts you probably didn't know that affect language. 98% of deaf children have hearing parents. 75% of deaf children have parents who do not sign. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine not having a conversation with your mom? That's always blown my mind. 98% of deaf children do not have access to education using ASL. 98%. Language deprivation is common among deaf children, and so is delayed language acquisition. Both of these delay learning and cognitive development. We'll learn more about how this affects the deaf community and deaf culture, but these are really important facts to keep in mind when you learn who signs what and at what age people acquired language. I have several friends who grew up learning, in being taught in school to speak and not acquiring ASL until they were in their 20s. And it's a very fascinating story. And the things that were not accessible to them just because of language, lack of language, we call it language deprivation. So anyway, we will learn more about that, but those are the three sort of signed systems that you may, that exist in the United States that you may see.